Hi everyone, and welcome to this Explorer question and answer session. My name is Claire McNulty, and I work for the National Geographic Society. And I have the unique fortune here to be working with and supporting our National Geographic explorers across Europe. So some of you may not know that as well as the amazing media that National Geographic produces, the Instagram, the channels, the magazine, we also give direct support to scientists, engineers, storytellers, teachers, all of who are trying to work to illuminate and, really importantly, protect the wonder of the world. And we do this through the National Geographic Society, which is a global non-profit organisation. And since our founding in 1888, we've given out more than 14,000 grants to people from all over the world. When we give someone a grant, they become a National Geographic explorer. And we've got explorers from many different countries, from diverse disciplines, different cultures, working on a variety of projects, whether that's looking at the past human civilizations or trying to protect the future of endangered species. And I know that we've got a lot of National Geographic explorers who are maybe tuning in today. So I just want to do a big shout out to you all. Hi, guys. And a big thank you to you for your passion, your curiosity, and particularly at the moment, your determination to make the world a better place, regardless of what's thrown at you. And we're all getting lots of things thrown at us at the moment, I think. So today is Shark Awareness Day, and right throughout July, it's also Sharkfest on the National Geographic Wild channel across Europe, US, and Africa. So you can see a load of different documentaries about these fascinating but often quite poorly understood creatures. So sharks have been around for millions of years, and they're really crucial for the health of our oceans. But many shark species are endangered, and millions of sharks are killed each year. We really need to know more about these creatures so that we can protect them. And that's why I'm really pleased to have with us today Dr. Yannis Papastamatiou. He's a National Geographic explorer, there's Yannis, and shark expert. He was born in London, but he's based now in Florida at the Florida International University, where he co-leads the Predator Ecology and Conservation Lab. It's where he's dialing in from now, actually. So he and his students study sharks and other predators, and they use what they learned to improve conservation efforts. Yannis is going to talk to us for about 10 minutes about the social lives of sharks, and then there's going to be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So please do put your questions in the chat box. We've already had some really interesting questions through on Instagram, so we're going to get to some of those as well. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. But that's it from me. I just need to hand over now to Yannis. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me here today. Let me just start up this presentation. Okay, so again, thank you for joining me today on Shark Awareness Day. And what I want to do is highlight an aspect of shark lives that you may not initially think of, and that is that these animals can be social. So when we talk about animal social lives, what do we mean? Well, really, social animals are animals that like to hang out with other animals. They live in groups for a variety of reasons. So you can imagine a school of fish or a flock of birds or pride of lions, groups of mammals. And this can be for a variety of reasons. It may improve their hunting success, protect them from predators. It may be for mating reasons or to raise their young. But when we talk about social animals, you probably don't immediately think of sharks. In fact, this is the image most people have of a shark. It's a beautiful white shark, but it's of this sort of fierce killing machine, often solitary hunters. But the more we learn, the more we realize just how complex these animals are and how they have behaviors that we just only really now starting to understand. So, for example, we know that sharks are capable of learning. In fact, there have been studies that have been able to train sharks to perform very basic tasks. We even know that some sharks can learn by watching other sharks perform these tasks. And we know that some sharks are capable of displaying body language. So, for example, in this sort of series of grainy pictures you can see here, these were taken in the 70s in Marshall Islands, I believe. And some underwater photographers, there was a series of cases where these photographers were getting bitten by these grey reef sharks. And just before they got bitten, they noticed that these sharks were sort of behaving kind of strangely. They would drop their fins, they would arch their back, and they start sort of swimming in this spiral manner. The shark on the far right is behaving normally. So then some researchers started to study this, and what they came up with was the sharks were actually displaying body language. They were sending a warning to the divers that they were feeling threatened. It was an anti-predation warning. They didn't want to bite them, but they were saying, look, you need to back off or I'm going to bite you because I'm feeling threatened. Now, of course, the photographers didn't know what that meant at the time. They didn't back off, and they were bitten. But now we understand what it means. And there's now even perhaps examples of this behavior being displayed between sharks. So these are more complex animals than we give them credit for. So some simple questions that the simple questions are not easy to answer are, do sharks form social bonds? Do they like to spend time with other sharks? Do they form groups? And if so, why is that? How do we study shark social systems? Studying any sort of animal social system in the wild is very hard to do. Think about if I tried to do that with humans, let's say in an office, and I wanted to map the social structure of humans in the office. Well, I could go and interview everybody and say, who are you friends with and how much do you like this person? But imagine I take away that ability to interview. Then how do I do that? Well, one thing I can do is measure how much time individuals spend with each other, under the assumption that the stronger your social bond with somebody, the more time you spend with that person. So we can try to do the same thing with sharks. Look at how much time they spend with other individuals and see if there's any sort of social structure. So one of my colleagues, Johan Morier, did this with this species. This is black-tip reef sharks. This was done in French Polynesia. And what he did was he was able to identify individual sharks because he could take pictures. And if you look at the markings on the dorsal fin, you can see they have this very sort of characteristic pattern. So it's very similar to a fingerprint. You can identify individual sharks. And he would go out over many days, over multiple years, and photograph sharks and try to see if the same individuals were turning up with other individuals. So do certain individuals like to hang out with other individual sharks? And by doing that over several years, he was able to produce this sort of a pretty picture you see here. And this is what we call a social network diagram. And basically, every square or circle represents an individual shark. And the mathematics in the algorithm that produced this diagram essentially clumps or clusters individuals that have stronger social associations, meaning they like to spend more time with each other. And what you can see here is that this is evidence of social communities within this population of black-tip reef sharks. And you can see distinctive communities. You can see the blue community, the red community, the yellow community. Individuals within that community like to spend time with each other, but they don't really like to form associations with individuals from different communities. Now, there are some exceptions. If you can see my arrow here, if I can find it, here we go. So, for example, this blue individual here seems to be pretty well connected amongst several different communities. So this is what we call a well-connected individual. So this shows you that you do have social structure within wild shark populations, at least some shark populations. And this can also tell us more. So, for example, we can use things like this to look at how information might spread throughout these social communities. Now, imagine I was to spread a rumor throughout the office, and I want to see how that rumor will spread. Well, it's going to depend on the social network. Imagine you have two groups in the office, and there's not one person that's friends with both groups. So if I start to spread that rumor, it may spread through one group or the other, but it won't spread between both groups. But if you have one well-connected individual who can spread that rumor between the two groups, now it can spread. So obviously sharks aren't spreading rumors, but there's other forms of information that can spread throughout these communities. We're also developing new methods to try to measure or record social associations of sharks in the wild. So one of the things we're doing is using these electronic tools known as business card tags. And these are essentially tags that go on the sharks. And you can see our shark here with the yellow tag. And they detect other tagged sharks. So our sharks with the red tags, for example, have acoustic transmitters on them that are emitting a sound wave. They have a specific ID so we can identify individuals. And basically our shark swimming around with the yellow tag is able to keep a record of which sharks it has been hanging around with, almost like it's keeping a record of business cards that other individuals have given it. So by doing that, we can start to see who hangs out with whom in the wild. So this is a method that we're currently using to look at perhaps social associations in white sharks. And I'll just show you a quick clip of how we attach a business card tag. This is my colleague, Fred Boyle, and he's able to just go up and attach the tag directly to the shark while swimming directly to its dorsal fin. So this is an ongoing project, but we are starting to see that there's already evidence that certain white sharks like to hang out with certain other white sharks. They are forming social associations. But the social structure is going to be very different from what you saw with the reef sharks. So it's going to vary from species to species, and even within a species, it may vary from place to place. The questions then become, well, why do they form these social associations? It's not obvious like it may be for some other animals. What are the advantages of being in a group? Well, some advantages may be related to hunting. Maybe your chance of success goes up if you are hunting in a group. So here's some video footage that was taken in, let me just find my, so this was shot in Fakarava in French Polynesia by Laurent Balesta, the filmmaker, and his team. It was part of the film 700 Sharks. And you can see grey reef sharks hunting reef fish at night. Now, they're not hunting cooperatively, but they do seem to be foraging as a group, and I'll get into why that may be in a moment. Here you can see them attacking a moray eel. There's probably no way one shark would be able to take out a large moray eel like that by itself. But why would they forage in these groups, and why would that be an advantage? Again, we don't necessarily see evidence of complex cooperation like you may see in orcas, for example. So what else could explain it? Well, this may go back to the information transfer that I was talking about earlier. So here's some footage that I shot in Fakarava. I was lucky to join Laurent's team on 2 expeditions. So this is taken at night. These are all grey reef sharks. There's no bait in the water. This is all natural foraging and hunting. We filmed these with closed circuit rebreathers, so you see no bubbles. And what you'll see is you'll suddenly see all the sharks sort of accelerate towards something towards the left of the screen, and you'll suddenly see they become much more oriented with each other. There's much more structure in how they all swim towards there. Now I look down, as I look up, you'll see all the sharks accelerate towards something on the right. Now what happened here is that one grey reef saw a reef fish and it went for it. The reef fish tried to escape, but then another shark saw the shark go for the reef fish. Another shark saw the shark that saw the shark, and so forth. So that information spread throughout the group. And in this case, information is the location of prey. So you don't even need anything complex. You don't have to have complex cooperation where everybody has a specific job. Simply by the fact that if I see some food and you see me go after the food, then you may be able to get that food, and vice versa. And that may be enough to drive us having a social association. These animals may also form groups for defensive reasons. We like to think of sharks being at the top of the food chain, but for most species, that's not true. There's very few species of shark that are truly top predators, and they can have their own predators, particularly other sharks. So here you can see a great hammerhead that went into a group of adult grey reef sharks and caught and killed one of them. So being in a group can have a defensive advantage. You have more eyes, meaning you're more likely to detect a predator. So in this case, information is where is a predator. Also, by being in a group, your chance of being the unlucky individual that may be targeted goes down. So you may simply have a lower chance of being killed just because there's more of you in that group. And then final reason that I'm going to discuss, and there are other reasons, of course, I could go on all day about potential advantages of being in a group, so I've just simplified it, is related to mating and reproduction. Now, this takes place seasonally in sharks, so only certain times of the year. And shark mating is very different than reproductive behaviors in other fishes, in that they mate very similar to mammals. So this is footage I shot in Roca Partida in Mexico, and these are white-tip reef sharks. And what you basically have here is a sort of pre-mating display where you have one or maybe more females being followed by groups of males. And you'll see some of the males start trying to grab a hold of the female and try and turn her over so they can mate with her. So they have these sorts of rituals that we are now quite familiar with, but there's still a lot we don't know. So for example, does the female choose which male to select to mate with? Is there mate selection? So obviously this only takes place during certain times of the year, but during these periods, you'll have quite elaborate grouping behavior and social interactions and associations. So I'll just end with a very, again, sort of simple question as to why is this important? Now, from my standpoint, I just find shark social lives fascinating. I called the title of my talk, The Secret Social Lives of Sharks, and that's not because they're keeping it a secret, but rather I'd say that we've only had the ability to detect this social structure in the last 10 years or so, in terms of having the technology to study it or the analytical skills to detect it. It's not obvious like in other animals. So for example, if you're studying primates, you can see primates grooming each other, or you may see a mother taking care of her young. That's much clearer what the social interaction is. With sharks, it's much more cryptic as to what exactly is going on. But there can also be conservation reasons for this as well. if these animals have evolved systems that require large numbers of other sharks. For example, if you forage as a group, what happens if their population sizes get reduced due to human effects? What happens if you have evolved to forage socially and now you don't have large numbers of individuals? How does hunting success go down? So these also have conservation questions as well. So again, thank you for listening. I would like to just thank these individuals who have provided video and helped with a lot of the research as you see. And thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Yannis. That was fantastic. I love the idea of the gregarious, gossipy shark who kind of moves between two social networks. That's brilliant. I've got hundreds of questions that I would like to ask you, but we've also had a load of questions submitted through Instagram and YouTube. So I'm going to start with some of the ones that were pre-submitted through Instagram. And first up from Tom, and this I think speaks to probably what a lot of people are thinking. A lot of people might be a bit scared at what you're doing, but a lot of people would love to be doing what you're doing. And so Tom asked, do you have some advice for somebody who wants to do what you're doing someday?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say there's many different ways you could have, or there's several different ways you could have a career that would involve sharks. It doesn't just have to be research. It could be in conservation or management. It could be in the diving industry or the tourism industry. So it doesn't have to be just for research. If you do want to go via the research route and you're interested in studying these animals, then I think it's just important to not forget you have to have the basics, meaning that the really sort of key traits for any science, and biology is no exception, is being good at math, being good at using computers, basics of physics, things like that again may not necessarily appeal to you, but believe me, later on they're going to become critically important, and even more so. So make sure you always have a very good background in the basics and get as much sort of training experience as you can with math, again, computer skills, things like that.
Great. And yeah, I would definitely be a proponent of STEM skills. They're vital for everything. I am biased as a scientist, obviously. Next up, quick question from Fayaz. Is the skin of a shark rough or slippery?
So it depends which way you rub your hand across the shark skin. So if you go from head towards tail, it's going to be smooth. If you go from tail towards the head, it's going to be rough. And that's because of the scales that the sharks have, which essentially are almost like little teeth, but they're pointing in a sort of posterior direction. So again, if you're going tail towards head, it's like sandpaper.
Okay, I didn't know that. I was assuming they would be smooth. Cool. So Charlie on the YouTube chat asks, what shark species are there in the UK? And I think you've got a story about the first shark you saw as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so actually the very first shark I ever saw in the wild was on a dive in the UK, and that was a cat shark. I don't remember the species. It was a long time ago. But that was the first time I ever saw a shark underwater. So you have a variety of different cat sharks, for example. And then you have some bigger sharks there as well. You have porbeagle sharks, mako sharks. You have basking sharks. The UK is probably one of the best places in the world to see basking sharks, if not the best in the world. So there's blue sharks. So you actually have quite a lot of shark species in the UK.
Okay, cool. And I think there's actually an article on Nat Geo UK website, which is all about what type of sharks you can see in the UK, if anyone's interested. So talking about different types of shark, you showed a hammerhead shark, which is one of my kind of favourites, I think. And William, who submitted a question on Instagram, asked, why did hammerheads evolve that way? They're such strange looking creatures.
It's a very good question, and researchers have been trying to answer that for a long time. And I don't know if there's necessarily a definitive answer, but there's a couple of potential reasons. One is actually due to the swimming. And actually, there's an idea that sort of cephalofoil, which is what we call the head, helps them in terms of their turnings. They're able to turn. If you look at hammerheads turning, for example, they can often turn on a very tight radius, and that may be due to that hammer-shaped head. Another potential reason is that the sensors that detect electric fields, which sharks are able to do, are located on the snout. And so by having those distributed across those sort of hammerhead shaped snout, they can essentially survey a large area. So they'll use that to go over the sand and try and detect things that may be buried in the sand, much like you would with a metal detector. But it's just like having a metal detector that's covering a much larger area, which means you can sample more. So those are a couple of the reasons that may have driven the evolution of the hammerhead shaped head.
Cool. So Sarah's submitted a question on YouTube. She's asking, what database do you use for the photo ID?
I don't actually, the photo ID work is not mine, so I couldn't answer that question. That was a colleague of mine who had done that research. So there would be better people to answer that question. I don't do any photo identification work myself.
Yeah, no worries. At Chubbs has asked, what's the bite force of a shark and what's their top speed? I don't know if you know that one.
The bite force, I do not know. There are some measurements out there, and I know some colleagues have measured bite force, so the answer is there. I just don't know what it is. As for top speed, that's actually something we're trying to measure. It's very difficult to do because we now have very advanced sensors that can measure speed. In fact, I have one right here. So this is a speed sensor, for example, that will measure the speed of a shark. But when you put them on a shark, you obviously don't know that that individual is going to decide to go at top speed. Right. So I know we recorded bursts of 6 meters per second, but for some of the really fast swimmers like mako sharks, which I have never seen a speed sensor data, but I imagine they're going to go faster than that. So I don't know, but something can go pretty fast.
And here's a question that I know you know is, have you ever been bitten by a shark? Istihak is asking. And if you have, what does it feel like?
I have, and it hurts. So I've actually been bitten twice on my hand. And I will say that both times was by a shark that I was tagging. So I'd caught it, put a tag on, was about to release it, and got bitten. So you can't blame the shark for doing that. I've never been bitten while swimming or diving in the water and minding my own business.
Okay, cool. And I think that's a common thing, right? People are much more afraid of shark bites than they actually need to. I saw something about you're more likely to die taking a selfie than be killed by a shark. So yeah.
Yeah, the probability is extremely low.
Yeah. So Sammy is asking on YouTube, how many rows of teeth does a white shark have, and does it depend on their age?
Good question, and I don't know. I mean, they do obviously lose their teeth throughout their lifespan, but I don't know if they replace the various rows or not. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that question.
It's all right. We're not expecting you to know everything. Tilly asked on Instagram, how do sharks communicate? You talked a lot about them connecting, but how do they actually communicate?
Well, again, it's something we really know very little about. So they don't make any vocalization. So they're not communicating in that way. They may, as was sort of implying, they have sort of body language, and they may well be visual, and that's probably the most likely reason that they have visual displays that they can use to at least provide some signal to others. And then there may also be chemicals. So for example, when I showed the mating video, one of the things we believe is that females are releasing pheromones, and that the reason you get that train of males is that the males are able to smell those pheromones, and that is essentially the signal.
Okay, so they don't speak, they don't vocalize, they don't make noises to communicate, but it's through other methods that they're communicating. Okay. It sounds like there's a lot more to learn in this area as well, actually, which I guess is
it's really just, although we find out more and more every year, I think the more we find out, the more we realize how little we know.
Yeah. Here's one that Holly sent in earlier through Instagram. And I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can kind of elaborate a bit. And this is about the role that sharks play in the ecosystem and how they're connected to other species.
That's a very good question, and which is very difficult to answer because, first of all, it's going to vary greatly based on the species of shark. So although we like to categorize them as just sharks, there's a big difference between a white shark and a cat shark in terms of their ecological role. For those that are on the upper end or the top of the food chain, we might expect them to have some effect on the abundance of animals in the lower trophic levels, and we have examples of that. So for example, there are cases where as sharks abundance goes up or down, you may see some changes in the abundance of other animals like rays or some other fish. But giving a definitive answer is very difficult to do, and we don't really fully understand the ecological role of sharks. Again, we're starting to understand some of the mechanisms. So, for example, we know that tiger sharks will cause dolphins to leave habitats where there's lots of fish for them to eat because it's not safe. So the dolphins aren't eating as much as they would if the sharks weren't there. So what effect does that have on dolphin population sizes? Well, we have that link, but we still don't fully understand what that means for dolphin populations, for example. So we're starting to get the pieces together, but we haven't put them all together. And so it's difficult question to answer. So I guess I would give a sort of general response of, we think at least some of them are probably going to have an important role, but we don't know exactly what it is.
Okay, cool. I guess with everything with these complex ecosystems, you don't know what happens until you take something away, and you really don't want to be taking something away a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's the problem is, we can't do, well, we have very limited experimental manipulation. Obviously, we have to sort of rely on natural occurrences, and that makes it challenging.
So Owen's put in a question on YouTube, and he asks, within sharks' social groups, is there a broad spectrum of ages and genders, or do you get clusters of juveniles or older sharks, or male sharks, female sharks?
So again, it's a great question, and obviously it'll vary. So first of all, not all shark species are going to be social. So there's several species that show very little gregariousness, as we would say. Within the others, you do tend to see separation. So, for example, juveniles tend to be separate from adults. And that is obviously that the pressures they face vary. So if you're a small juvenile shark, your chance of getting eaten is much higher than if you're an adult. So you may see cases where there's social groups in the juveniles, but not necessarily in the adults. You may see some cases where there's no social groups as juveniles, but there are as the adults. So the pressures they face vary, but I would expect that you're going to see some differences based on the age category. But again, for most species, you do see separation in terms of at least the space they use between adults versus juveniles.
Right. So sometimes you do see the teenagers all hanging out together then, basically.
Yeah, you often can find, groups of very small pups, and often in very shallow or sheltered areas where it's going to be safer for them.
Cool. So Ethan submitted this, and this was submitted before your talk, and he asks, do you ever get the chills before getting into a shark cage? Now, I don't know if you use a shark cage, because the images that we see are actually of you diving outside of a cage.
No, we do use a cage. So for white sharks, again, in that case, we do sometimes do out of the cage stuff, but it's that's a species you have to be very, very cautious with. There's lots of white shark individuals that I would not want to be outside of a cage with. So we see individual differences in behavior. There are some individuals that just seem bad tempered, and there's no way I want to be outside of a cage with that shark. So we do work in a cage. I don't get chills going into a cage. No, I will say there's certainly cases where I still get nervous being free swimming.
Right. Yeah, I guess you've been bitten a couple of times.
I was always on the boat.
That was always your fault.
Yeah,
right?
so that, but just you've got to treat these animals with respect. They're large predators, and a large predator can certainly hurt you. It's not going to feel bad about it. It's very unlikely, but it can happen. And if you don't treat it with that respect, it's can turn out badly.
Absolutely. So Maria's put in a question, I think, which follows on from the previous question about the social groups, is if you know if they're closely related genetically at all.
Another great question. And in fact, I have a couple of colleagues who are trying to answer that question now. So they're looking at the social groups in relation to how closely related individuals are. So genetic relatedness is very important for other animal social groups. We don't know whether that's true for sharks or not. Maybe some of my colleagues have an answer already. I know they have the data and are analyzing it, but I don't know what the results are.
Okay. Quick one here from Giles, who submitted it through Facebook. Is it true sharks have to keep moving or they'll die?
So that is true for some species. So some species have to swim continuously to get enough water over the gills to get oxygen from the water. But there are still plenty of species that can lie on the bottom and actually do what we call buccally pumping. They can just basically use their mouth to pump water over the gills, and they don't have to swim continuously. So as white-tip reef sharks I showed at the end, for example, you can often find them sleeping on ledges or in sand or under caves.
Oh, nice. So another question from Facebook. Denise asked, is it true that more than 1 million sharks are killed by humans every year?
It can be way more than that. It can be 70 to 100 million every year. It's the numbers can be very high, but they fluctuate a lot, and it's very difficult to measure the total number of sharks killed. So that number, I think, may have been revised now. So I don't know what the current estimate is.
Okay. So we were almost at the time. We've got time for maybe a couple more questions. We had one in from Kira through Instagram, and she asked, what is your favorite species of shark?
My absolute favorite is probably going to be the oceanic whitetip, which was I showed a picture of one. It's an open ocean shark, and just a fascinating species. It lives in the oceanic equivalent of the desert, so it plays with very little food. So I just admire it for that reason.
Great. And I'm actually going to combine two questions into one now. So Jackson through Instagram asked about the oldest shark we know about, but Alex also asked about the existence of the megalodon. So I don't know if you can talk about both of those as the final question.
Yeah, so I know there was a Greenland shark that was aged to over 200 years old, and I forget what the exact age was, but I know it was over 200. So there are some sharks that are able to live to a very, very long age. And as for the megalodon, no, we can confirm that it is extinct.
Okay, that's been fantastic, Yannis. I think we're going to have to end it now, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody for watching, and just leave me to say happy Shark Awareness Day. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.